In the art gallery of a North German city hangs a lurid oil painting which represents two Italians waylaying and attacking a third. I will tell you the history of the painting. In the 90s of the last century, a young German painter was living on the outskirts of Rome in an isolated little house surrounded by a vineyard. One fine, bright moonlit night, after sitting over the wine till a late hour with 2 or 3 friends down in the city, he came home about midnight. He had to walk some distance beyond the end of the streetcar line through a narrow road that ran between high walls. He never came through that lane late at night without a feeling of apprehension. He was a poor man, he never wore jewelry, his modest brown cape and dilapidated broad-brimmed hat were very much like the clothing of many of his modest neighbors, visibly not the appurtenances of a man of means, and he had had no love affairs in Rome, so it did not seem as if any sort of ambush was likely. He thought a good deal about his fiancée back in Germany, and he almost always carried a letter from her in his left inside vest pocket, just over his heart. As he walked home, he was in the habit of whistling to keep his courage up, of talking aloud to himself, bursting out every now and then with, "That's certainly a fact," or, "Yes, I think that's what I'll do." And he was likely to call out at intervals to his little dog, a Spitz who never strayed far from his master's heels. He always carried a revolver on his person, although in all the years since he had acquired it, he had never once had occasion to fire it off. But when he came near his garden gate, he never failed to find himself shivering with apprehension till his slightly trembling fingers had the gate unlocked. He could almost visualize a big fellow gliding around the corner and stepping out threateningly in front of him. He always had his key in his hand before he reached the gate, and he always pushed the key into the lock with nervous haste. On dark nights, he would hold his lighted cigar toward the lock with the other hand. Then he would lock the gate behind him in a great hurry, unlock his house door just as nervously, light the candle which stood waiting for him to the left of the door on the uneven tile floor, try the door which led into the ground floor rooms, all of them unoccupied except the kitchen, and utilized as lumber rooms to store his artist supplies, and climb the creaking stairs to the upper floor, where were located his spacious studio and his little bedroom. The bedroom was scarcely more than an alcove, and it always stood wide open into the studio, so that as he lay in bed he could see the great wide window and the starry heavens outside. His trip home on this particular evening had not been without disquieting incidents. Nothing very definite had happened, and he might have attached no importance to anything that had occurred if he had not been made a little apprehensive by the eerie turn the conversation in the artist group had taken. His Spitz had stopped and barked furiously into a linden tree alley a few hundred yards from his garden gate. It was true that the dog had a nervous streak in him, and often grew excited over nothing at all. A little earlier, as the artist was getting off the streetcar, a very suspicious-looking and acting man in ragged work clothes had asked him how to reach the Valley San Giorgio, a lonely little valley with a chapel in the center of it, a sort of ravine which lay behind and below the eminence on which his house was built, and which no human being in his senses would have thought of visiting at that hour of the night. Then, as he came through the narrow street between the high walls, he could have sworn he heard steps on the hard ground behind him. The impression was so strong that he turned and looked back more than once. But no one was visible, and it was only while he himself was walking that he seemed to hear the steps. They must have been only the echo of his own steps in the uncanny stillness of the night. Finally, at a turn of the crooked little street, he had come suddenly within a few feet of a man who was going in the same direction, but more slowly. The man turned and looked at him, then walked slowly away on a path that branched off from the little street. The painter had had only an indefinite impression of the man's bearded face, but his artist eye had taken in the squat, heavy frame, which stood out plainly in the moonlight, the peculiar swing of the man's walk, and even the wavering shadow which showed rather distinctly on the wall beyond him before he turned into the footpath. When he had himself come abreast of the path and peered fearfully down it, the man had disappeared. There were no buildings along the path, and it was distinctly visible for some distance. It seemed as if the earth had swallowed the man, or he might have dodged behind a clump of bushes. But why would he have done that? It was strange. For a few minutes the young painter had been almost uneasy. Then all at once the artist in him had gained the upper hand. He realized that the shape and manner of the bearded pedestrian had been very much what he had had in mind for a figure in a violent night scene which he was planning to paint, and he regretted that he had not seen the man's face more distinctly. He began to lay plans for sketching what he remembered of the face and figure before he went to bed, and in his cheerful planning he completely forgot his apprehension, till his dog had begun to bark frantically at the entrance of the linden alley. Arrived at home, the painter had hauled his preliminary sketch out of a corner, set it up on an easel, and rapidly drawn in with charcoal the outlines of the man with the beard. He had originally planned to make this person the aggressor in an encounter. He had thought of him as rushing out from his concealment behind a wall and running with drawn sword at a favored rival who had just said goodbye to a lady at the gate of an imposing palazzo. But some mysterious influence seemed to guide him into a change of plan. He of the beard must be the victim, not the attacker, and he must be set upon by 2 men. The painter took out a fresh sheet and sketched in the new idea. It was curious how definitely the impression had come to him. He knew exactly where to place each individual, how to direct each motion. But the face of the bearded defender, the man whose life was forfeit to these vicious assassins, would not come clear to him. Finally, he grew tired of searching, undressed, and went to bed. Tomorrow, he said to himself, when I am fresher, I shall be able to think the thing out better. He went to sleep at once and slept soundly, but in the course of the night, he had no idea how long he had been asleep. He started up in bed with the definite impression that he had heard something, a call, a cry, or voices talking together. He listened. Complete silence. If he had heard anything, it must have been in his dream. It did seem to him as if he had had a dream, and that he had dreamed about something disturbing, something alarming, but he could not remember what the dream had been about. He was in the act of lying down again when he glanced into his studio, which lay bathed in the moonlight from the great window. He saw his dog standing erect in the center of the room, his head thrust forward and turned toward the window, watching and listening intently, without barking. He had never seen the animal act like that before. The painter called softly. The dog gave no sign of hearing him. He did not change in the slightest his attitude of absorbed interest. Then the painter raised his eyes to the window. At first, it seemed to him as if he must be dreaming still. He threw the bedclothes aside, stared at the window, brushed his hands across his eyes, and gazed again. There was no doubt about it. The painter's eyes were looking into the eyes of the bearded man, whose conduct had puzzled him the night before. It looked as if the man had climbed up and stood on something that lifted him breast high before the second-story window. The rough-boned, carelessly kept face with the tangled hair and beard was unmistakably the face he had caught a glimpse of on his way home a few hours before. It was frightfully distorted. The eyes were wide open and staring, the lips were open and drawn back from the teeth. It seemed almost as if the man were uttering a terrified cry for help, but not a sound was audible. On the left temple there was an ugly wound, with the hair matted over it, but with the blood still trickling down over the face. There was no sign of the hands, the arms fell straight down from the shoulders. It almost seemed to the painter, as he studied the figure and its attitude a little more calmly, as if someone had pushed a dead man up into the window from below. Then, all at once, the horrible apparition disappeared, noiselessly, and the painter saw the trees and the quiet sky behind and above them. At that moment, the dog's muscles relaxed from his position of tense watchfulness. He ran to his master, cowered against him as if seeking protection, turned his head back toward the window. Then he sat down expectantly before the painter, exactly as he was in the habit of doing when he saw the artist take down his hat and his caped cloak to go out. For a moment, the distracted artist could do nothing but stare at the rectangle of moonlight where the ghastly figure had been. Then he realized the changed attitude of the dog and spoke to the animal. When the little creature saw that he had his master's attention, he stood up, wagged his tail, and looked around expectantly toward the stairway. The artist took his revolver and went to the window. The moonlit landscape was calm and silent, not a sight or a sound. If a gang of assassins had held a murdered man up to his window a minute or two before, they could scarcely have made so complete a getaway in so short a time. The shutters on the window below were closed and locked. There was nothing to climb up by, and except for the feeling that he had heard something in his dream, the painter was sure that not a sound had reached him from outside the building. The dog ran back and forth between the artist and the stairway. Animals have remarkable leadings, and the painter thought seriously of making the rounds of the garden. But it seemed to him, as he thought it over, that such a procedure would be useless at best, and that at worst it would be courting trouble. If bandits were about, what could one timid citizen, armed with an old revolver that had never been fired in its life, do against them? All that could be expected of him, certainly, was to watch from inside his house till morning. He closed his window and ordered the dog back to his cushion. Just before he drew the window down, he had had the impression that he heard steps run rapidly along the stone pavement that lay just below it. He raised it again and looked down. No one was in sight, and not a sound was to be heard. He stood by the window, struggling to get a grip on himself. He wondered if he could be ill. He knew that various delusions came from physical causes within the one who experiences them. He had tried so desperately hard to visualize the head which he needed for his picture, that his effort, combined with the effect of the heavy Falerno wine he had drunk, might easily have produced a psychic effect which caused him to see visions and hear sounds that had transpired only in his imagination. He had almost convinced himself that he had found the key to the enigma, when his glance fell on his dog, obediently crouching on his cushion, but still wide-eyed and excited. It seemed to him exactly as if someone spoke out from right behind him. But what about the dog? Does your psychopathic theory explain the way the dog is acting? Suddenly the painter's mood of anxiety and puzzlement gave way to one of impatience. He was tired and nervous. He was disgusted with the whole annoying affair. He dropped on his bed again, and in a mood of something like defiance, he flung off the perplexity and dropped into a heavy sleep. Nothing happened till morning. When the bright sun shone into the window instead of the ghostly moon, he was ready to laugh the whole matter off as a half-tipsy dream, and to class the dog's strange conduct with various other evidences of unaccountable nervousness, which that animal had shown at various times. He sat down at his easel and went seriously to work at his new sketch. He discovered that he knew the bearded face now, feature by feature, and the task went smoothly. It was marvelous how vividly the face and form of the heavy fellow came out under the artist's eager fingers. This would be his best picture, he was sure of that. As he was working, he heard somebody knock at the door downstairs. He made a few rapid strokes still, hastily kicked off his slippers and pulled on his shoes, and went down. It was doubtless the peasant woman, he thought, who brought him his milk every morning, but who brought it at the most unaccountably irregular hours. If she wasn't willing to follow a fairly even schedule, there was no reason why he should discommode himself to keep her from waiting a minute or two. When he opened the door, there was no woman there, and no milk can. He strolled down the walk toward the fountain at which the milkwoman often stopped to water her donkey. As he came near the fountain, he heard voices. When he passed the clump of bushes that had hidden the place from his sight, he discovered an excited group arguing and gesticulating about some object which lay on the ground. There were 2 policemen in the group. "Has something happened?" he inquired as he joined the circle. "They killed a man last night," said one of the bystanders. One of the policemen asked the painter if he had seen or heard anything that might throw any light on the mystery. He was about to tell his ghost story when it occurred to him how improbable it was, and he contented himself with replying that as he had walked home late at night, a man in front of him had turned into the little side path, and that before he had left the streetcar, a man had asked the way to the Valley San Giorgio. "Would you know the man in front of you if you saw him again?" The painter was not sure, but he thought he remembered certain things about him. For example, he remembered very distinctly that the man had a beard. The policeman looked up quickly. "Is this the man?" he asked, and drew off the sack which had covered the head of the prostrate form. The painter started back in terror, and for a moment his voice failed him completely. There was the head he had seen in the window, the eyes still staring wide, the matted hair clinging about the wound over the left temple, the wild, scraggly beard. The look of anguish and appeal was still in the eyes that gazed up into the eyes of the painter, as if the deed were not yet committed and the man was begging him to come to his aid. And as the living man gazed with fascinated horror into the eyes of the dead man, the expression of the eyes seemed to change to one of reproach. The little dog had been ready and anxious to dash out and help defend the victim of a band of assassins, but his master had been too stupid, too selfish, too cowardly to come to the assistance of a fellow being in distress. The painter recovered his self-control and said dully to the policeman, "Yes, I think that was the man." "Did you know him?" asked one of the neighbors with whom the German painter had a bowing acquaintance. And when the painter shook his head, the voluble Italian prattled on, "It is much better that the bandits made away with this man than if they had killed a gentleman like you. He was—" and he touched his finger compassionately to his forehead. From the general discussion that followed, the artist learned that the dead man, who for a good part of his life had been a shepherd in the Alban Hills, was a strange dreamer of a fellow who claimed to have the gift of second sight, to be able to foretell the future, and to have the power to cure disease by prayer. Members of the group told various stories of strange proofs of his psychic powers, notably of one instance in which he had described in great detail a fire which was raging at that same moment in a town 100 miles away, and of which he had no possible means of knowledge. "It is strange," said one of the neighbors thoughtfully, "that he didn't foresee what would happen to him when he came out here last night." "Perhaps he did foresee it," said one of the policemen, who had been looking through a handful of papers which had come from one of the dead man's pockets. Among these papers, many of them old and worn from long friction in the pocket, was a clean sheet, on which was printed out very carefully, "I am going a hard way. Perhaps I shall not come back, but I am saving another man's life." The murderers were caught a few days later. They were two vagabonds of known evil habits, both of whom had already served prison sentences. When they were examined, they confessed that they had intended to kill the painter and plunder his isolated house at their leisure, but that in their excitement they had mistaken one man for another who was dressed very similarly. They had intended, they said, to break into the studio that same night, but had been so frightened when the dying shepherd had called their attention to their blunder, and had warned them solemnly never to carry out their murderous plan against the painter, that they had taken to their heels in a panic. And so it comes that the picture of the half-crazy Italian shepherd who saved the life of a young German painter is hanging today in a German art gallery. The sound of a shot suddenly broke the stillness of the May morning and echoed back from across the valley. A puff of blue smoke arose from a clump of greenbriers and drifted away downwind. Out in the road, Abner Simmons dropped the bag of grain he was carrying, and with a look of dumb surprise, sank in a quivering heap to the ground. Half his side had been shot away. The greenbriers parted with a sudden life, and Jed Tolliver emerged, straightening his long form as he shambled toward the road. As he walked, he broke his double-barreled shotgun, flicked out the empty cartridge, and blew through the barrel, sending a thin stream of acrid smoke out of the chamber. He stooped over his fallen enemy. "Said I'd get you," he reminded the other brutally. He inserted a fresh cartridge and closed the gun with a snap. The man in the road rolled over with a convulsive movement and stared up at him. "That kid brother of yours is next, and last," Jed continued. "Then I'll be through with the lot of you." Abner grinned. It is an awful thing to see a dying man grin. Jed shuddered in spite of himself. "You can't, Jed. Not Ezekiel." It was not a pleading. Rather, it was calm, assured, as though the other were stating a known fact. Jed shuddered again, before he felt quick anger rising. "I got you, didn't I?" he said, ejecting a thick stream of tobacco juice. "What makes you think I won't get Ezekiel the same way?" "You won't, Jed. You can't. Because I won't let you." He was fast weakening from the frightful flow of blood. Overcome from the effort of speaking, Abner closed his eyes and lay still. A second later, a sudden convulsive movement shook his body, and his eyes opened again. This time they were fixed and staring. With a grunt of satisfaction, Jed shouldered his gun and started back up the mountain, moving with the long, effortless stride of the Tennessee mountaineer. He did not fear punishment for his crime. Here in the Tennessee mountains, the long arm of the law seldom reached. The only thing to fear in a case of this kind was the dead man's relatives, and now there was only one, Ezekiel, a slim lad of 20, who could not even shoot expertly. Yes, Jed reflected, as his long strides carried him through the sparse growth of cedar and blackjack. This part of Tennessee would soon again be a decent, God-fearing community. Foreigners, the Simmonses had been, from somewhere back east, Carolina or Virginia maybe. They hadn't been like the mountain folk. And what was that crazy talk Abner had made? He'd stop Jed from getting Ezekiel. How could he, if he was dead? Jed chuckled to himself. Here in Tennessee, folk didn't believe. More than a week passed before Jed again took his well-oiled shotgun from its place on the wall and started over the mountain. He was in no great hurry about Ezekiel. Instead, he rather enjoyed waiting. Ezekiel was the last of the 3 Simmons brothers, and knowing that the foreigner was over there and that he was going to kill him, gave life a curious sort of zest. Likely the kid didn't even know who shot his brother. Jed laughed silently at the thought, adding to himself that the boy probably wouldn't do anything about it if he did know. He wasn't like the mountain people. But this morning all of Jed's impatience had returned. The sun shone hotly on the Tennessee hills, and raised an almost visible veil of vapor from the tiny branches which sowed through the hollow. Well, he'd waited long enough. With a grimace of distaste at the 3-mile traipse across 2 mountains, Jed swung his gun over his shoulder and started down the slope. When, an hour and a half later, he arrived at the small clearing which was the Simmons place, he was not as tired as he had expected to be. The nervous exhilaration of the manhunt buoyed him up, made him tensely aware of things around him. He paused only a moment at the fringe of scrub oak that bordered the clearing. Then, bending almost double, he sprinted 100 feet to the grape arbor. Safe inside the leafy bower, Jed leaned his gun against a supporting post and looked about. Here, the vines had been trained over a rude wooden lattice so that a thick wall and a roof of leaves now effectively hid him from anyone outside. Jed parted the leaves carefully and peered out. 100 feet behind him was the low wall of forest he had just left. 200 feet in front of him was the house, a rude 2-room shack. 200 feet beyond that, the wall of the forest began again. Jed looked at the house more closely. There was no sign of movement, but the thin line of smoke which curled from the chimney told him that Ezekiel was inside, probably preparing his midday meal. With a sigh of contentment, he sat down and leaned back closer to his gun, idly listening to the chatter of birds in the forest and the rustling of the leaves in the arbor. How long Jed sat there, he did not know. He was suddenly aroused from a semi-stupor by the sound of a banging door. Startled into instant activity, he swung around to peer through the leaves. Ezekiel was leaving the house, swinging in his hand an empty water bucket. Going to the spring, Jed reckoned. If so, his path would take him within 50 feet of the arbor. Jed gloated. With hands suddenly unsteady, the man in the arbor laid his gun on the ground, the muzzle barely extending through the leaves. Why take a chance? He would wait. At 50 feet, he couldn't miss. Unmindful of his danger, Ezekiel came slowly down the path, bearing diagonally nearer to the arbor. Jed suddenly wondered why he no longer heard the aimless chatter of birds in the forest, why the light wind no longer stirred the broad leaves above him. It was uncanny, this noonday quiet. Impatiently, he shook off the feeling. "So I can't do it, Abner?" he whispered to the empty air, but somehow the words clutched at his throat, and he wished he hadn't said it. No matter, a few seconds now. Jed cursed the trembling of his hands as he aimed. What was the matter with him? He could see Ezekiel's slender form now, above the barrel of his gun. He nerved himself to pull the trigger. The top of his head suddenly gone cold, Jed dropped the gun and looked quickly around him. No, the day was bright as ever, yet he could have sworn. Half-heartedly now, he picked up the gun to sight at the form which had already passed the nearest point. He had not been wrong. A black, nebulous cloud hovered over the barrel of his gun and created the illusion of darkest night. Shrieking a curse, Jed Tolliver leapt upright and pointed, not aimed, the gun at where Ezekiel should be. He snapped both triggers simultaneously, but as he fired, something clutched at his arm, and the hot lead sizzled harmlessly through the air. Shaking as with a chill, blind rage within him struggling with black fear, the mountaineer stood irresolutely within his leafy ambush. He was quickly aroused to activity by a loud report and the crash of lead against the wooden lattice. A sharp pain burned his left arm, where one of the pellets had found its mark. Ezekiel had fled to the house and opened fire. Without waiting to reload his gun, Jed crashed through the side of the bower and fled to the safety of the trees. As he entered, buckshot spattered harmlessly around him. Safe within the sheltering growth, Jed halted to reload his gun. "Damn you, Abner," he shouted to the stunted oaks. "I'll get him yet." As he turned to go, he thought he heard a low, mocking laugh, but reasoned later that it was only a squirrel chattering a protest at the sound of his voice. Jed reached home in a blue funk. The long tramp across the mountains in the early summer heat had melted away most of his fears, but his nerves were still badly shaken. Now that he could look at the incident in a sober light, he refused to credit his senses. As the distance between himself and the scene increased, He had come more and more to believe the occurrence a hallucination, brought on by the long walk through the heat. After all, he recalled, he had almost fallen asleep in the arbor while waiting for Ezekiel to appear. Perhaps he had dreamed part of it. However logical Jed believed his explanation, he did not again go near the Simmons place. Weeks passed. Always he promised himself that he would soon finish the task so ingloriously begun, but day by day he waited until nearly 3 months had gone. At first he had feared Ezekiel had recognized him in those few seconds it had taken to sprint from the grape arbor to the cover of the woods. Later, as he heard nothing of it, he decided he was safe from that side. The end came in an unexpected manner. One afternoon early in August, Jed had walked to the village. He stayed longer than he had intended, and shadows were already growing long when he started home. Not wishing to be out later than necessary, he took a shortcut through the woods, which would take him within a half-mile of the Simmons place. The sun was setting as he entered the Simmons Hollow, a half-mile below the house. He felt vaguely uneasy. Though he told himself he was not frightened, he found himself wishing for the protection of his gun. Nervously, his hand strayed to the hunting knife stuck in his belt, and tested the keen edge. Walking diagonally across the hollow, which was largely devoid of trees, he turned aside to go around a cluster of young cedars, which was directly in his path. Suddenly, he drew back sharply. Again, his hand tested the keen edge of that knife, but not this time from nervousness. 200 feet beyond the cedars, on the smooth, unbroken grass floor of the hollow, was a man milking. His back was turned to the cedars, but Jed thought he recognized that slim, youthful form. He believed it was Ezekiel. Stepping lightly, one hand on his belt where he could immediately grasp the knife, Jed moved into the open. Halfway across the level space, his hand moved yet closer to the knife, while the ghost of a grin curved his lips. Without a doubt, it was Ezekiel Simmons. The man milking did not look up. The milk jetted into the half-filled bucket with a low murmur, just loud enough to mask Jed's guarded footsteps. Step by step, Jed advanced. If only Ezekiel did not see him. If only the cow did not sense his presence and turn unexpectedly. Step by step, further, Jed was tense with excitement. There was no midday sun this time to blind his eyes and fill his soul with a nameless fear. Nor would he be unnerved by the twilight stillness. It was always still at sunset, here in these mountains. 10 feet now. The milk still swished into the pail uninterruptedly. The steady grinding of the cow's molars never ceased. Suddenly, Jed tugged at his belt and leapt forward. "Got you!" he shouted aloud. But the exultant cry died suddenly into a moan of horror. The arm bearing the knife poised high for the blow, Jed felt something like an electric shock course through its length. Instead of swinging forward to strike the man in front of him, the knife turned in his hand, his wrist and elbow bent at a crazy angle, and the razor-edged steel ripped through the cords of his neck. Staggered more by his realization of the awful consequences than by present pain, Jed sank to the grass, while gouts of blood spurted from a torn jugular. His first mad terror past, he became aware that Ezekiel was standing over him, scorn darkening his features. "So it was you, Tolliver. Abner warned me about you. I'd have got you too, only Abner was a good brother. He told me, weeks before he died, that if anything happened, he'd guard me." Jed felt himself weaken. His head was strangely without weight, and objects around swam lazily in the pale twilight. He lay back on the grass. "Should have got you, Ezekiel. Shouldn't have missed," he murmured sleepily as the shadows gathered. He raised his head slightly to listen. Was that a light mocking laugh he heard in the grass beside him? He listened again before the darkness came down. No, he could not be sure. The watchman's flashlight printed a white circle on the frosted glass black-lettered door. Gregg Chemical Company, manufacturers. Asa Gregg, president. Private. The watchman's hand closed on the knob, rattled the door in its frame. Queer, but tonight the sound had seemed to come from in there. But that couldn't be. He knew that Mr. Gregg and Miss Carruthers carried the only keys to the office, so any intruder would have been forced to smash the lock. Maybe the sound came from the storage room. The watchman clumped along the rubber-matted corridor, flung his weight against that door. It opened hard, being of ponderous metal fitted into a cork casing. The room was an airtight, fireproof vault, really. His shoes gritted on the concrete floor as he prowled among the big porcelain vats. The flashlight bored through bluish haze to the concrete walls. Acid fumes escaping under the vat lids made the haze and seared the man's throat. He hurried out, coughing and wiping his eyes. It was damn funny. Every night lately he heard the same peculiar noise somewhere in this wing of the building. Like a body groaning and turning in restless sleep it was. It scared him. He didn't mention the mystery to anyone, though. He was an old man, and he didn't want Mr. Gregg to think he was getting too old for the job. "Asa'd think I was crazy if I told him about it," he mumbled. Inside the office, Asa Gregg heard the muttered words plainly. He sat very still in the big leather-cushioned chair, hardly breathing until the scrape of the watchman's feet had thinned away down the hall. There was no light in the room to betray him, only the cherry-colored tip of his cigar, which couldn't be visible through the frosted glass door. Anyway, it would be an hour before the watchman's round brought him past the office again. Asa Gregg had that hour, if he could screw up his nerve to use it. He took the frayed end of the cigar from his mouth. His hand, which had wasted to mere skin and bone these past few months, groped through the darkness, slid over the polished coolness of the dictaphone hood, and snapped the switch. Machinery faintly whirred. His fingers found the tube, and lifted it. "Miss Carruthers," he snapped. Then he hesitated. Surely he could trust Mary Carruthers. He'd never wondered about her before. She'd been his secretary for a dozen years. Lately, since he couldn't look after affairs himself as he used to, she had practically run the business. She was 40, sensible, unbeautiful, and tight-lipped. Hell, he had to trust her. His voice plunged into the darkness. "What I have to say now is intended for Mrs. Gregg's ears only. She will take the first boat home, of course. Meet that boat and bring her to the office. Since my wife knows nothing about a dictaphone, it will be necessary for you to set this record running. As soon as you have done so, leave her alone in the room. Make sure she's not interrupted for a half hour. That's all." He waited a decent interval. The invisible needle peeled its thread into the revolving wax cylinder. "Jeanette," muttered Asa Gregg, and hesitated again. This wasn't going to be easy to say. He decided to begin matter-of-factly. "As you probably know, my will and the insurance policies are in the vault at the First National. I believe you will find all of my papers in excellent order. If any questions arise, consult Miss Carruthers. What I have to say to you now is purely personal. I feel, my dear, that I owe you an explanation. That is..." God, it came harder than he had expected. "Jeanette," he started in afresh. "You remember 3 years ago, when I was in the hospital. You were in Palm Beach at the time, and I wired that there'd been an accident here at the plant. That wasn't strictly so. The fact is, I'd gotten mixed up with a girl." He paused, shivering. In the darkness, a picture of Dot swam before him. The oval face, framed by gleaming swirls of lemon-tinted hair, had pouting scarlet lips, and eyes whose allure was intensified by violet makeup. The full-length picture of her included a streamlined, full-blossomed, and yet delectably lithe body. A costly, enticing Broadway chorus orchid. As a matter of fact, that was where he'd found her. "I won't make any excuses for myself," Asa Gregg said harshly. "I might point out that you were always in Florida or Bermuda or France, and that I was a lonely man. But it wasn't just loneliness, and I didn't seek companionship. I thought I was making a last bow to romance. I was successful, 60, and silly, and I did all the damn fool things. I even wrote letters to her." The dictaphone couldn't record the grimace that jerked his lips. "She saved them, of course, and by she put a price on them, $10,000. Dot claimed that one of those filthy tabloids had offered her that much for them, and what was a poor working girl to do? She lied, I knew that. I told her to bring the letters to the office after business hours, and I'd take care of her. I took care of her, all right. I shot her, Jeanette." He mopped his face with a handkerchief that was already damp. "Not on account of the money, you understand. It was the things she said, after she had tucked the bills into her purse. Vile things about the way she had earned it 10 times over by enduring my beastly kisses. I'd really loved that girl, and I'd thought she'd cared for me a little. It was her hate that maddened me, and I got the gun out of my desk drawer. Asa Gregg reached through the darkness for the switch. He fumbled for the bottle which stood on the desk. His hand trembled, spilling some of the liquor onto his lap. He drank from the bottle. This part of the story he'd skip. It was too horrible even to think about it. He didn't want to remember how the blood pooled inside Dot's fur coat, and how he'd managed to carry the body out of the office without leaking any of her blood onto the floor. He tried to forget the musky sweetness of the perfume on the dead girl, mingled with that other evil blood smell. Especially, he didn't want to remember the frightful time he'd had stripping the gold rings from her fingers, and the one gold tooth in her head. The horror of it coiled in the blackness about him. His own teeth rattled against the bottle when he gulped the second drink. He snapped the switch savagely, but when he spoke, his voice cringed into the tube. I carried her into the storage room. I got the lid off one of the acid tanks. The vat contained an acid powerful enough to destroy anything, except gold. In fact, the vat itself had to be lined with gold leaf. I knew that in 24 hours there wouldn't be a recognizable body left, and in a week there wouldn't be anything at all. No matter what the police suspected, they couldn't prove a murder charge without a corpus delicti. I had committed the perfect crime, except for one thing. I didn't realize that there'd be a splash when she went into the vat. Greg laughed, not pleasantly. His wife might think it had been a sob when she heard this record. Now you understand why I went to the hospital, he jerked. Possibly you'd call that poetic justice. Oh God, his voice broke. Again, he thumbed off the switch and mopped his face with the damp linen. The rest, how could he explain the rest of it? He spent a long minute arranging his thoughts. You haven't any idea, he resumed. No one has any idea of how I've been punished for the thing I did. I don't mean the sheer physical agony, but the fear that I'd talk coming out of the ether at the hospital. The fear that she'd be traced to my office. I'd simply hidden her rings away, expecting to drop them into the river, or that she might have confided in her lover. Yes, she had one. Or suppose a whopping big order came through and that tank was emptied the very next day. And I couldn't ask any questions. I didn't even know what was in the papers. However, that part of it gradually cleared up. I quizzed Miss Carruthers and learned that an unidentified female body had been fished out of the East River a few days after Dot disappeared. That's how the police solved the case. I got rid of her rings. I ordered that vat left alone. The other thing began about 6 months ago. A spasm contorted his face. His fingers ached their grip into the dictaphone tube. Jeanette, you remember when I began to object to the radio, how I'd shout at you to turn it off in the middle of a program. You thought I was ill and worried about business. You were wrong. The thing that got me was hearing her voice. He gripped the cold cigar, chewed it. It's very strange that you didn't notice it. No matter what station we dialed to, always that same voice came stealing into the room. But perhaps you did notice. You said once or twice that all those blues singers sounded alike. And she was a blues singer. It was she, all right, somewhere out in the ether reminding me. The next thing was, well, at first, when I noticed it in the office, I thought Miss Carruthers had suddenly taken up with young ideas. You see, I kept smelling perfume. And he smelled it now. It was like a miasma in the dark. It isn't anything that Carruthers wears, he grated. It comes from, yes, the storage room. I realized that about a month ago. Just after you sailed, one night I stayed late at the office and I went in there. It seemed to be strongest around the vat, her vat, and I lifted the lid. The sweet, sticky musk smell hit me like a blow in the face. And that isn't all. Terror stalked in this room. Asa Gregg crouched in his chair, felt the weight of fear on him like a submarine pressure. His cigar, pitched to his knees, dropped to the floor. You won't believe this, Jeanette. He hammered the words like nails into the darkness in front of him. You'll say that it's impossible. I know that. It is impossible. It's a physiological absurdity. It contradicts the laws of natural science. But I saw something on the bottom of that vat. He groped for the bottle. His wife would hear a long gurgle and then a coughing gasp. The vat was nearly full of this transparent, oily ad, he went on. What I saw was a lot of sediment on the golden floor, and there shouldn't have been any sediment. The stuff utterly dissolves animal tissue, bone, even the common ores, keeps them in suspension. It didn't look like sediment either. It looked like a heap of mold, grave mold. I replaced the lid. I spent a week convincing myself that it was all impossible, that I couldn't have seen anything of the sort. Then I went to the vat again. Silence hung in the darkness while he sucked wind into his lungs, and the words burst, separate yammering shrieks. I looked, night after night. For hours at a time, I've watched the change. Did you ever see a body decompose? Of course not. Neither have I. But you must know in a general way what the process is. Well, this has been the exact opposite. First, I stared at the heap of grave mold as it shaped itself into bones, a skeleton. I watched the coming of hair, a yellow tangle of it sprouting from the bare round skull, until, God, the flesh began making itself before my eyes. I couldn't bear any more. I stayed away, didn't come to the office for 5 days. The tube slipped from his sweating, slick fingers. Panting, Asa Gregg fumbled in the dark until he found it. Exhaustion, not self-control, flattened his voice to a deadly monotone. I tried to think of a way out. If I could fish the corpse out of the tank. But I couldn't smuggle it out of the plant alone. You know that, and so do I. Besides, what would be the use? If acid can't kill her, nothing can. That's why I can't have the lid cemented on. It wouldn't do any good either. Until 3 days ago, she hadn't the least color, looked as white as a ghost in the vat. A naked ghost, because there's been no resurrection for her clothing. I've watched her limbs grow rosy, her lips are scarlet, her eyes are bright, they opened yesterday, and her breasts were rising and falling, almost imperceptibly, but that was last night. And tonight, I swear it, her lips moved. She muttered my name. She turned. She'd been lying on her side, over onto her back. The record would be badly blurred. His hand shook violently, bobbled the tube against his lips. Gregg braced his elbow against the desk. She isn't dead, he choked. She's only asleep. Not very soundly asleep. She's waking up. The invisible needle quivered as it traced several noises. There was his tortured breathing and the clawing of his fingernails rattling over the desk. The drawer clicked as it opened. The loud click was the cocking of the revolver. Soon she's going to get out of that vat, Gregg bleated. Jeanette, forgive me. God forgive me. But I will not. I cannot. I dare not stay here to see her then. The sound of the shot brought the watchman stumbling along the corridor. He crashed against the office door. It banged open in a shower of falling frosted glass. The watchman's flashlight severed the darkness and printed its white circle on the face of Asa Gregg. He had fallen back into the chair, a blackish gout of blood running from the hole in his temple. He stared sightlessly into the light, with eyes that were 2 gnarls of shrunken brown flesh, like knots in a pine board. Asa Gregg was blind, had been, since that night 3 years past, when the acid splashed. I never knew anyone so keenly alive to a joke as the king was. He seemed to live only for joking. To tell a good story of the joke kind, and to tell it well, was the surest road to his favor. Thus it happened that his 7 ministers were all noted for their accomplishments as jokers. They all took after the king, too, in being large, corpulent, oily men, as well as inimitable jokers. Whether people grow fat by joking, or whether there is something in fat itself which predisposes to a joke, I have never been quite able to determine, but certain it is that a lean joker is a rara avis in terris. About the refinements, or as he called them, the ghost of wit, the king troubled himself very little. He had an especial admiration for breadth in a jest, and would often put up with length for the sake of it. Over-niceties wearied him. He would have preferred Rabelais' Gargantua to the Zadig of Voltaire, and upon the whole, practical jokes suited his taste far better than verbal ones. At the date of my narrative, professing jesters had not altogether gone out of fashion at court. Several of the great continental powers still retained their fools, who wore motley with caps and bells, and who were expected to be always ready with sharp witticisms at a moment's notice, in consideration of the crumbs that fell from the royal table. Our king, as a matter of course, retained his fool. The fact is, he required something in the way of folly, if only to counterbalance the heavy wisdom of the 7 wise men who were his ministers, not to mention himself. His fool, or professional jester, was not only a fool, however. His value was trebled in the eyes of the king by the fact of his being also a dwarf and a cripple. Dwarfs were as common at court in those days as fools, and many monarchs would have found it difficult to get through their days are rather longer at court than elsewhere, without both a jester to laugh with and a dwarf to laugh at. But as I've already observed, your jesters, in 99 cases out of 100, are fat, round, and unwieldy, so that it was no small source of self-gratulation with our king that in Hopfrog, this was the fool's name, he possessed a triplicate treasure in one person. I believe the name Hopfrog was not that given to the dwarf by his sponsors at baptism, but it was conferred upon him, by general consent of the several ministers, on account of his inability to walk as other men do. In fact, Hopfrog could only get along by a sort of interjectional gait, something between a leap and a wriggle, a movement that afforded illimitable amusement, and of course consolation, to the king, for, notwithstanding the protuberance of his stomach and a constitutional swelling of the head, the king, by his whole court, was accounted a capital figure. But although Hopfrog, through the distortion of his legs, could move only with great pain and difficulty along a road or floor, the prodigious muscular power which nature seemed to have bestowed upon his arms, by way of compensation for deficiency in the lower limbs, enabled him to perform many feats of wonderful dexterity, where trees or ropes were in question, or anything else to climb. At such exercises he certainly much more resembled a squirrel or a small monkey than a frog. I'm not able to say with precision from what country Hopfrog originally came. It was from some barbarous region, however, that no person ever heard of, a vast distance from the court of our king. Hopfrog, and a young girl very little less dwarfish than himself, although of exquisite proportions and a marvelous dancer, had been forcibly carried off from their respective homes in adjoining provinces, and sent as presents to the king by one of his ever-victorious generals. Under these circumstances, it is not to be wondered at that a close intimacy arose between the 2 little captives. Indeed, they soon became sworn friends. Hopfrog, who, although he made a great deal of sport, was by no means popular, had it not in his power to render Trippetta many services, but she, on account of her grace and exquisite beauty, although a dwarf, was universally admired and petted, so she possessed much influence, and never failed to use it, whenever she could, for the benefit of Hopfrog. On some grand state occasion, I forgot what, the king determined to have a masquerade, and whenever a masquerade or anything of that kind occurred at our court, then the talents, both of Hopfrog and Trippetta, were sure to be called into play. Hopfrog, in especial, was so inventive in the way of getting up pageants, suggesting novel characters, and arranging costumes for masked balls, that nothing could be done, it seems, without his assistance. The night appointed for the fête had arrived. A gorgeous hall had been fitted up, under Trippetta's eye, with every kind of device which could possibly give éclat to a masquerade. The whole court was in a fever of expectation. As for costumes and characters, it might well be supposed that everybody had come to a decision on such points. Many had made up their minds as to what roles they should assume, a week or even a month in advance, and in fact there was not a particle of indecision anywhere, except in the case of the king and his 7 ministers. Why they hesitated I never could tell, unless they did it by way of a joke. More probably they found it difficult, on account of being so fat, to make up their minds. At all events, time flew, and as a last resort they sent for Trippetta and Hopfrog. When the 2 little friends obeyed the summons of the king, they found him sitting at his wine with the 7 members of his cabinet council, but the monarch appeared to be in a very ill humor. He knew that Hopfrog was not fond of wine, for it excited the poor cripple almost to madness, and madness is no comfortable feeling. But the king loved his practical jokes, and took pleasure in forcing Hopfrog to drink, and, as the king called it, to be merry. "Come here, Hopfrog," said he, as the jester and his friend entered the room. "Swallow this bumper to the health of your absent friends." Here Hopfrog sighed. And then let us have the benefit of your invention. We want characters. Characters, man, something novel, out of the way. We're wearied with this everlasting sameness. Come, drink. The wine will brighten your wits." Hopfrog endeavored, as usual, to get up a jest in reply to these advances from the king, but the effort was too much. It happened to be the poor dwarf's birthday, and the command to drink to his absent friends forced the tears to his eyes. Many large bitter drops fell into the goblet as he took it, humbly, from the hand of the tyrant. "Ha!" roared the latter, as the dwarf reluctantly drained the beaker. "See what a glass of good wine can do. Why, your eyes are shining already." Poor fellow. His large eyes gleamed rather than shone, for the effect of wine on his excitable brain was not more powerful than instantaneous. He placed the goblet nervously on the table, and looked round upon the company with a half-insane stare. They all seemed highly amused at the success of the king's joke. "And now to business," said the Prime Minister, a very fat man. "Yes," said the king, "come lend us your assistance. Characters, my fine fellow, we stand in need of characters, all of us." And as this was seriously meant for a joke, his laugh was chorused by the seven. Hopfrog also laughed, although feebly and somewhat vacantly. "Come, come," said the king impatiently, "have you nothing to suggest?" "I'm endeavoring to think of something novel," replied the dwarf abstractedly, for he was quite bewildered by the wine. "Endeavoring?" cried the tyrant fiercely. "What do you mean by that? Ah, I perceive. You are sulky and want more wine. Here, drink this." And he poured out another gobletful and offered it to the cripple, who merely gazed at it, gasping for breath. "Drink, I say," shouted the monster, "or by the fiends." The dwarf hesitated. The king grew purple with rage. The courtiers smirked. Trippetta, pale as a corpse, advanced to the monarch's seat, and falling on her knees before him, implored him to spare her friend. The tyrant regarded her for some moments, in evident wonder at her audacity. He seemed quite at a loss what to do or say, how most becomingly to express his indignation. At last, without uttering a syllable, he pushed her violently from him, and threw the contents of the brimming goblet in her face. The poor girl got up the best she could, and not even daring to sigh, resumed her position at the foot of the table. There was a dead silence for about half a minute, during which the falling of a leaf or of a feather might have been heard. It was interrupted by a low but harsh and protracted grating sound, which seemed to come at once from every corner of the room. "What are you making that noise for?" demanded the king, turning furiously to the dwarf. The latter seemed to have recovered in great measure from his intoxication, and looking fixedly but quietly into the tyrant's face, merely ejaculated, "I? How could it have been me?" "The sound appeared to come from without," observed one of the courtiers. "I fancy it was the parrot at the window, wetting his bill upon his cage wires." "True," replied the monarch, as if much relieved by the suggestion. "But on the honor of a knight I could have sworn that it was the gritting of this vagabond's teeth." Hereupon the dwarf laughed. The king was too confirmed a joker to object to anyone's laughing, and displayed a set of large, powerful, and very repulsive teeth. Moreover, he avowed his perfect willingness to swallow as much wine as desired. The monarch was pacified, and having drained another bumper with no very perceptible ill effect, Hopfrog entered at once, and with spirit, into the plans for the masquerade. "I cannot tell what was the association of idea," observed he very tranquilly, as if he had never tasted wine in his life. "But just after your majesty had struck the girl and thrown the wine in her face, just after your majesty had done this, and while the parrot was making that odd noise outside the window, there came into my mind a capital diversion, one of my own country frolics, often enacted among us at our masquerades, but here it will be new altogether. Unfortunately, however, it requires a company of 8 persons, and—" "Here we are," cried the king, laughing at his acute discovery of the coincidence. 8 to a fraction, I and my 7 ministers. Come, what is the diversion?" "We call it," replied the cripple, "the 8 chained orangutans, and it really is excellent sport if well enacted." "We will enact it," remarked the king, drawing himself up and lowering his eyelids. "The beauty of the game," continued Hopfrog, "lies in the fright it occasions among the women." "Capital!" roared in chorus the monarch and his ministry. "I will equip you as orangutans," proceeded the dwarf. "Leave all that to me. The resemblance shall be so striking that the company of masqueraders will take you for real beasts, and of course they will be as much terrified as astonished. "Oh, this is exquisite," exclaimed the king. "Hop Frog, I will make a man of you." "The chains are for the purpose of increasing the confusion by their jangling. You're supposed to have escaped en masse from your keepers. Your Majesty cannot conceive the effect produced at a masquerade by 8 chained orangutans, imagined to be real ones by most of the company, and rushing in with savage cries among the crowd of delicately and gorgeously habited men and women. The contrast is inimitable." "It must be," said the king, and the council arose hurriedly, as it was growing late, to put in execution the scheme of Hop Frog. His mode of equipping the party as orangutans was very simple, but effective enough for his purposes. The animals in question had, at the epoch of my story, very rarely been seen in any part of the civilized world, and as the imitations made by the dwarf were sufficiently beast-like and more than sufficiently hideous, their truthfulness to nature was thus thought to be secured. The king and his ministers were first encased in tight-fitting stockinette shirts and drawers. They were then saturated with tar. At this stage of the process, someone of the party suggested feathers, but the suggestion was at once overruled by the dwarf, who soon convinced the 8, by ocular demonstration, that the hair of such a brute as the orangutan was more efficiently represented by flax. A thick coating of the latter was accordingly plastered upon the coating of tar. A long chain was now procured. First, it was passed about the waist of the king, and tied, then about another of the party, and also tied, then about all successively, in the same manner. When this chaining arrangement was complete, and the party stood as far apart from each other as possible, they formed a circle, and to make all things appear natural, Hop Frog passed the residue of the chain in 2 diameters, at right angles, across the circle, after the fashion adopted at the present day by those who capture chimpanzees or other large apes in Borneo. The grand saloon in which the masquerade was to take place was a circular room, very lofty, and receiving the light of the sun only through a single window at the top. At night, the season for which the apartment was especially designed, it was illuminated principally by a large chandelier, depending by a chain from the center of the skylight, and lowered or elevated by means of a counterbalance as usual. But, in order not to look unsightly, this ladder passed outside the cupola and over the roof. The arrangements of the room had been left to Trippetta's superintendence, but in some particulars, it seems, she had been guided by the calmer judgment of her friend the dwarf. At this suggestion it was that, on this occasion, the chandelier was removed. Its waxen drippings, which, in weather so warm, was quite impossible to prevent, would have been seriously detrimental to the rich dresses of the guests, who, on account of the crowded state of the saloon, could not all be expected to keep out at center, that is to say, from under the chandelier. Additional sconces were set in various parts of the hall, out of the way, and a flambeau, emitting sweet odor, was placed in the right hand of each of the caryatids that stood against the wall, some 50 or 60 altogether. The 8 orangutans, taking Hop Frog's advice, waited patiently until midnight, when the room was thoroughly filled with masqueraders, before making their appearance. No sooner had the clock ceased striking, however, than they rushed, or rather rolled in, altogether, for the impediments of their chains caused most of the party to fall, and all to stumble as they entered. The excitement among the masqueraders was prodigious, and filled the heart of the king with glee. As had been anticipated, there were not a few of the guests who supposed the ferocious-looking creatures to be beasts of some kind in reality, if not precisely orangutans. Many of the women swooned with fright, and had not the king taken the precaution to exclude all weapons from the saloon, his party might soon have expiated their frolic in their blood. As it was, a general rush was made for the doors, but the king had ordered them to be locked immediately upon his entrance, and at the dwarf's suggestion, the keys had been deposited with him. While the tumult was at its height, and each masquerader attentive only to his own safety, for in fact there was much real danger from the pressure of the excited crowd, the chain by which the chandelier ordinarily hung, and which had been drawn up on its removal, might have been seen, very gradually, to descend, until its hooked extremity came within 3 feet of the floor. Soon after this, the king and his 7 friends, having reeled about the hall in all directions, found themselves at length in its center, and, of course, in immediate contact with the chain. While they were thus situated, the dwarf, who had followed noiselessly at their heels, inciting them to keep up the commotion, took hold of their own chain at the intersection of the 2 portions which crossed the circle diametrically and at right angles. Here, with the rapidity of thought, he inserted the hook from which the chandelier had been wont to depend, and in an instant, by some unseen agency, the chandelier chain was drawn so far upward as to take the hook out of reach, and, as an inevitable consequence, to drag the orangutans together in close connection and face to face. The masqueraders by this time had recovered in some measure from their alarm, and beginning to regard the whole matter as a well-contrived pleasantry, set up a loud shout of laughter at the predicament of the apes. "Leave them to me," now screamed Hopfrog, his shrill voice making itself easily heard through all the din. "Leave them to me. I fancy I know them. If I can only get a good look at them, I can soon tell who they are." Here, scrambling over the heads of the crowd, he managed to get to the wall, when, seizing a flambeau from one of the caryatids, he returned as he went to the center of the room, leaping with the agility of a monkey upon the king's head, and thence clambered a few feet up the chain, holding down the torch to examine the group of orangutans, and still screaming, "I shall soon find out who they are." And now, while the whole assembly, the apes included, were convulsed with laughter, the jester suddenly uttered a shrill whistle, when the chain flew violently up for about 30 feet, dragging with it the dismayed and struggling orangutans, and leaving them suspended in mid-air between the skylight and the floor. Hopfrog, clinging to the chain as it rose, still maintained his relative position in respect to the 8 maskers, and still, as if nothing were the matter, continued to thrust his torch down toward them, as though endeavoring to discover who they were. So thoroughly astonished was the whole company at this ascent, that a dead silence of about a minute's duration ensued. It was broken by just such a low, harsh, grating sound, as had before attracted the attention of the king and his counselors, when the former threw the wine in the face of Trippetta. But on the present occasion, there could be no question as to whence the sound issued. It came from the fang-like teeth of the dwarf, who ground them and gnashed them as he foamed at the mouth, and glared with an expression of maniacal rage into the upturned countenances of the king and his 7 companions. "Aha!" said at length the infuriated jester. "Aha, I begin to see who these people are now." Here, pretending to scrutinize the king more closely, he held the flambeau to the flaxen coat which enveloped him, and which instantly burst into a sheet of vivid flame. In less than half a minute, the whole 8 orangutans were blazing fiercely, amid the shrieks of the multitude, who gazed at them from below, horror-stricken, and without the power to render them the slightest assistance. At length, the flames, suddenly increasing in virulence, forced the jester to climb higher up the chain, to be out of their reach, and as he made this movement, the crowd again sank for a brief instant into silence. The dwarf seized his opportunity, and once more spoke. "I now see distinctly," he said, "what manner of people these maskers are. They are a great king and his 7 privy councillors, a king who does not scruple to strike a defenseless girl, and his 7 councillors who abet him in the outrage. As for myself, I am simply Hopfrog, the jester, and this is my last jest." Owing to the high combustibility of both the flax and the tar to which it adhered, the dwarf had scarcely made an end of his brief speech before the work of vengeance was complete. The 8 corpses swung in their chains, a fetid, blackened, hideous, and indistinguishable mass. The cripple hurled his torch at them, clambered leisurely to the ceiling, and disappeared through the skylight. It is supposed that Trippetta, stationed on the roof of the saloon, had been the accomplice of her friend in his fiery revenge, and that together they effected their escape to their own country, for neither was seen again.